In our last session, we were looking at the Mosaic, or the Abrahamic and Mosaic stories, and we are now going to take a look in our session number 5 using the historical critical method. We're going to be looking at some books that purport to be history and see if what the stories are about a little bit, and also what historical criticism would say of these books in terms of whether they were actual history. The first 3 books we're going to look at very briefly, the books of Judith, Tobit, Esther. If you're in the Protestant canon of the Old Testament, Tobit and Judith do not make it. Esther does. In the Catholic and Orthodox canons, those 3 are part of the Bible. And the Jewish canon omits Tobit and places Judith and Esther in a grouping called the writings. And we had talked about the 3 classifications of writings that Jesus used, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. A word about the prophets. I'm not really going to take any time with that group. The major prophets are pretty much accepted as real people, and if you look at the book of Isaiah, which is the largest of the books and the most probably important in many ways as far as Christians are concerned, scholars have found that the book of Isaiah, which was originally thought to have been written by one man, the prophet Isaiah, it turns out that the thinking now is that the book was written in 3 phases by the first prophet, Isaiah, and then Deutero-Isaiah, which means second Isaiah, another person, and then Trito-Isaiah, the third writer that came later. But let's take a look at these writings. We're going to start with Judith. The story of Judith, which doesn't make it into the Protestant canon, as we said, is kind of couched as an historical book, and it comes rather early in the Bible, after the book of Judges. It's a very short book, 3 pages long, and we're just going to take a look at it. Now, the Protestant canon considers this as apocryphal. The word Judith means Jewish woman, and it brings into Scripture this heroine, and it's fitting into a period of history of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar that we've spoken of, the most famous of the Neo-Babylonian kings, about the 7th century and 6th century into that period. Anyway, we have this story of Judith. She is a heroine to the Jewish people. She basically works her way into a general of Nebuchadnezzar by the name of Holofernes into his camp, and she cuts his head off, and brings the head out, and that's a victory for the Jewish people. Is this history, or is this a heroine that was embraced in a fictional way? It reads like history, but in fact, most historical critical scholars, if not all, of any note, would say that that is a didactic history, or teaching history, fictive, didn't actually happen. We'll look at very briefly now the book of Esther, which does make it into both Catholic and Protestant canons. It tells the story of an even more famous Jewish heroine. This occurs after or during the reign of Xerxes. He ruled from 485 to 465 BC, and he was the king of Persia. He was the one that allowed the Jewish people to come back from Babylon and establish the temple, following the second temple, following the Temple of Solomon that was destroyed. He's also in this book of Esther known as Ahasuerus. He's married, or let's just call him Xerxes. He was married to a queen Vashti. And the queen refuses in the story to go and appear before her husband. And the result was the queen's out of a job. So the king looks for a new queen. And there's a character, Mordecai, that appears, and he becomes an enemy of the king's prime minister, Haman, for refusing to bow before Haman. So Mordecai, chosen to be the king's, Mordecai is secretly a Jew, as is his cousin Esther, who is chosen to be the king's new queen. Haman is described as a descendant of Agag, king of Amalek. Haman has revenge on his mind against the Jews for not allowing any of the Amalekites to survive, but that's another story. Haman persuades Xerxes in the book he appears to be rather naive and kind of a simpleton, that's Xerxes, persuadable and so forth, to issue a decree calling for the killing of all Jews. The king doesn't know that Esther, though, is Jewish, and she's the new queen. So she warns Xerxes of this Haman's plot to kill all the Jews, and as a result, the king hangs Haman on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai, who was the Jewish one that was a friend of Esther and relative. And Mordecai then is appointed as prime minister in place of Haman. And then for some unknown reason, Xerxes' edict that decreed the murder of the Jews cannot be taken back. So he issues another decree allowing the Jews to take up arms and to fight to kill their enemies, which they do. And to this day, Jews celebrate the Esther story on the Feast of Purim. And that's the feast with gift-giving, works of charity, and recitation in public of the book of Esther, and a meal of celebration of Jewish deliverance. The book of Tobit is not accepted by the Protestant canon as biblical. But that's a story that's very interesting, and it's also fiction. So we were dealing with three fictional stories as seen by historical critical scholars. Tobit is blind. This is an older man, and because the birds pooped in his eyes, basically, and he's lost all his money. And Jewish law, despite the commands of the Syrians, he is for keeping the strict Jewish laws, he's lost all his money to the Assyrians. So he's very sad, and he bewails his lot and prays for God to strike him dead. Now Sarah, another person in the book of Tobit, is in another part of the world. She's upset because she has had 7 husbands, each one of whom has been killed by the demon Asmodeus. And it's getting hard to find new husbands. So she gets very upset, prays to God to strike her dead. And so God intervenes, these two people, completely unrelated, hears the prayers and sends the angel Raphael to straighten things out. And so meanwhile, Tobit remembers suddenly that there's some money he gave to a friend a long time ago. And he decides to send his son, Tobias, to go get it. So if only they could find a guide who knows the way to the city where his friend lives. So, but lo and behold, Raphael appears, and he happens to know the way. So he agrees to guide Tobias. Along the way, Tobias catches a fish when it tries to swallow his foot. Raphael advises him to save the heart, liver, and gallbladder of the fish. Burning the heart and liver will cure a person who is being afflicted by a demon. Just in case Tobias happens to run out into such a person, while the gallbladder will cure blindness also. So Tobias and Raphael stop to spend the night at the house of Raguel and Sarah. Now Sarah comes out, and that Tobias is willing, although Sarah tries to suggest it might be a better idea to leave well enough alone. Nevertheless, they're married, and that night Tobias burns the heart and liver, which sends Asmodeus screaming into the night, where Raphael administers a little smackdown. Meanwhile, Raguel digs a grave so as to be able to get rid of the body early before the neighbors notice. And much to his and everyone's surprise, Tobias comes down for breakfast in the morning. And Raphael is sent off to fetch the money held by Tobit's friend, and then the whole party heads back home to Nineveh. Tobit's blindness is cured by the gallbladder, and between the money and his friend and Sarah's dowry, Tobit's fortunes are restored, and everyone lives happily ever after. So that story had people who weren't who doubted whether that was canonical. St. Jerome omitted it from his list, but St. Augustine and St. Ambrose maintained that it was canonical. Luther also, in following Jerome, omitted it, but it is considered canonical by the Church, the Catholic Church, not by the Protestants. We're going to now look very briefly at the Books of Kings. Now, these you would think would be very historical because they're listed as historical books by biblical professors and scholars, but not in the same sense all the way. Let's first of all clear up some terminology here. In the Vulgate, St. Jerome gives, there are 4 books. There's 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. In the King James Version, the book does not make a distinction between 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. What the King James Version has is 1st Kings, 2nd Kings, 3rd Kings, 4th Kings. So if you're reading the Vulgate or the Catholic versions, you're going to see 1st and 2nd Samuel, which really are 1st and 2nd Kings in the King James Version, and then 1st and 2nd Kings, which are really books 3 and 4 of Kings in the King James Version. Now the New International Version follow the Catholic listing, so we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. I hope that clears that up. Now, we look at the 1st and 2nd books of Samuel with some skepticism as to whether or not all of what is described there is history. There may be a lot of hyperbole there, and in the Oxford History of Biblical Writings, we have the following statement. More recently, the traditional assessment of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings as reliable in the first 11 chapters of 1st Kings, as reliable sources for understanding history has been turned on its head. So scholars look at that as a rather questionable history, but we see that there are dramatic tales of Samuel and Saul and of David and Solomon, and it's embedded in what is known as the Deuteronomic history. The information about the world is viewed as hopelessly exaggerated, if not outrightly made up. But recent archaeological surveys confirm the historical value of topographical details in those books. So once we get into the Davidic books, or the last 2 books of the 4 set, in other words, as the NIV would say, 1st and 2nd Kings, we do find what we think is true history, or at least history. Some of the stories about David and Goliath, and other stories, maybe some of those have some exaggeration as well. But we don't have any proof other than we have no proof. We have proof that David existed from non-biblical sources, but it's strange that in any of the other non-biblical sources, such as the ancient Near East texts, we don't have any reference to Saul and Samuel. So there's a question of whether they were in existence. Somebody probably was, because David came from the kings once the Jewish people, according to the Bible, wanted kings. Finally, I'm going to take a look at the writings that are considered wisdom writings and see if there's any parallels between those writings and the non-biblical writings of the time. The book of Job is a good example for one. Job, as you know, is this just man who was was a very wealthy man. He had children and he had a lot of property in terms of animals, and he had a wife, and all of a sudden, in stages I should say, what he had was taken away from him by disaster. Parties that the kids were going to, they were all killed, and his animals were all taken away, or he lost them. So 3 friends of his appear, and they are in great sympathy with Job because of his terrible misfortunes. And the writings go on in the book of Job, and we see the main critical part of this is that these friends of his really are blaming Job for sinning, and Job is constantly maintaining his innocence. There's nothing that I've done that should cause this. The Jewish concept was that if you were a good person, you would be blessed in this life with a lot of wealth and good fortune, children, and all the things that a married person would want in that time and even today. So the idea that good fortune came from being good was turned on its head with the book of Job. And at the very end of the book, Job, while protesting his innocence again and again and again, in a series of cycles of speeches, God interrupts Job and says, look, I'm God. You don't know how all these things happen, like you don't know how the whales come about. You don't know how cubs of lions are born. You don't know anything. You're just a human being, basically. So stop acting like you think you know everything. And Job has to admit it, and he apologizes to God, saying, I can't compete with you, basically. I don't know all that material that you're talking about. I have no knowledge of all of the wonders of creation. And God blesses Job after he makes this admission of not knowing. There's no answer to this in terms of suffering. Why did Job have to suffer? Why did the good have to suffer? There's no answer given in the book of Job. But the bottom line of this is that the friends of Job are scolded by God, and Job is given double what he had before. So that's the story of Job. Now, is this book found in another way, or is it in another source that predates that to give the idea that maybe some of this material was taken from pagan sources? We do have Sumerian writings that talks about a good man who suffers. This writing is found in a work called Man and His God. If you happen to have a copy of the ancient Near East texts, you can find that in that book about this story of a man who is suffering. A poem and dating around to 1000 BC comes from an Akkadian work, the Dialogue About Human Misery, and that's also found in the ancient Near East textbook. And it almost has the same dialogue as the book of Job. For example, it starts with the sufferer. Where is the counselor to whom I can relate my trouble? I am finished. Anguish has come upon me. And then his friend says, respected friend, what you say is sad. Dear friend, you have let your mind dwell on evil. You have made your good sense like that of an incompetent person. You have changed your beaming face to scowls. And so there's this dialogue again between the sufferer and the friend seems to blame the sufferer for his own misfortune. Now, there's also, in terms of the another writing, the book of Proverbs in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there we see some strikingly similar proverbs coming from sources that predate the book of Proverbs. The Egyptian culture had writings, two of which are they're called instructions, and one of them was the writing of Ptahhotep. I'm going to spell that for you. The instruction of Ptahhotep. That's Ptahhotep. And I'm going to read a little part of that. It's from about 3,580 BC, and it was found in a papyrus book in Egypt. So it starts out, or it reads, "If you want a perfect conduct to be free from every evil, guard against the vice of greed. A grievous sickness without cure, there is no treatment for it. It embroils fathers, mothers, and the brothers of the mother. It parts wife from husband. It is a compound of all evils, a bundle of all hateful things. The man endures whose rule is rightness, who walks a straight line. He will make a will by it. The greedy has no tomb. Be generous as long as you live. What leaves the storehouse does not return. It is the food to be shared which is coveted." So those are kind of instructions about good and evil that is found to a greater degree in the book of Proverbs. This work, like the book of Proverbs, contains examples of parallelism, both synonymous parallelism, which restates the idea of the first line in a different way, and then synthetic parallelism, which expands upon what has been stated in the first line. So we have examples of that. The one that I think is the most grotesque, but also very, very instructive, as the dog returns to his vomit, the evil man returns to his way. So we have a very graphic and grotesque image of a dog vomiting, that an evil man would do the same thing. Like the dog would return and eats the vomit up. So the man who is evil does the same thing over and over again, continues to do evil things. There's another one called the Instruction of Amenonope. It's found in an Egyptian papyrus, and it has 30 chapters of Proverbs written about 1200 BC, and this would precede the book of Proverbs. In the book of Proverbs, we have this proverb. It states, "Direct your ear and hear wise words. Set your heart to know them, for it is pleasant if you keep them in your inmost self." Now in the Egyptian book, it says, "Give your ears and hear what is said. Give your mind over to their interpretation. It is profitable to put them in your heart." So that's almost exactly the same proverb, one coming from a pagan source, the other coming from the book of Proverbs. Another one. In Proverbs we have this one. "Have I not written for you 30 counsels and teachings to teach you what is right and true?" And in the Egyptian work we have, "Mark for yourself these 30 chapters. They please, they instruct, they are the foremost of all books." So again, a very similar proverb. And finally, one more. The book of Proverbs has, "Do not make friends with people prone to anger. With the hot-headed person do not associate." In the Egyptian writing it says, "Do not fraternize with the hot-tempered man, nor approach him to converse." So we have some examples there of writings that, while they're not the same, exactly the same, they seem to precede and are taken by biblical writers as from the instructions of the scribes in Israel. Okay, so we have one more series left in this understanding the Bible using the historical critical method, and that will be on the New Testament, and we will look at the four writings of the Gospels and some of the problems as to historical critical analyses.